want to start this morning with something I saw on the internet, and I read it. It was a kind of a statement, and it referenced an article that I went to. And it was about a certain tribe in Africa that when a boy reaches about 10 or 11 years of age, the father of that child takes him into the forest, into the jungles. And the ritual of becoming a man, then he has to go to this certain spot they have. It's a big rock out in the middle of the worst part of the jungle. And they put the boy on it and they blindfold him entirely. And they do this in the early afternoon. And the law is he must sit there on that rock blindfolded, not move, not take that blindfold off until he can feel the warm rays of the sun on his face the next morning. And he's got to prove himself brave enough to sit out there. So the guy took his little son out there. He was about 10 years old, 11 years old, and left him there on that rock. And of course, it began to get darker and darker and darker, and bugs were biting him, and it was kind of miserable out there. Of course, then he heard every sound in the jungle. Animals fighting each other and eating each other and growling and snarling and all this stuff. And he was a little bit cold, because it gets cold sometimes, even in the equatorial regions at night. And he was scared to death. He was petrified. He just sat there, but he didn't take his blindfold off. And he didn't get off that rock. He sat right there just like his father told him to all night long. And the minutes slipped by like hours. Every minute just seemed eternal. And he was scared to death. But he focused on breathing one breath at a time, one breath at a time. Then finally the sun started to rise and he felt those warm rays of the sun on rather cool skin. And he felt it, and he could see things brightening up a little bit. So he knew the sun was rising, and he was allowed to take off that blindfold. And he took it off, and only then he realized his father was sitting right behind him all night long with an awful big stick and a spear. But think about what that boy went through. Think about how hard and scary life can get and how incredibly dangerous it can be. And yet the father was standing right behind him all night. Didn't leave him 1 second alone. Jesus came to tell us of that very same story. The Lord promised way, way, way back in Deuteronomy, I will not leave my children alone. I will not leave them as orphans, scared and subject to a very dangerous world. I will be right behind them all the way. And then when we got to where we didn't believe that anymore, because the world's a scary place, he sent his son, and Jesus said basically the same thing. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. In your entire life, I will be standing behind you or beside you, but you will never be alone. It was in that promise then that Jesus told us all about the kingdom of heaven, about the resurrection. And not only will we live here on this earth with him, but we'll spend eternity with him reigning in heaven. And of course, a lot of people that go, no, that can't be true, because they're nasty people. The priests thought they would get in, but everyone else, no, not so much, because they're not priests. And Jesus, of course, hung around with the bad guys and said, truly I tell you, he's talking to the priests, that tax collectors and harlots will get into heaven before you guys do. And that kind of aggravated them. So they had to come up with a plan to get rid of Jesus and all these promises about God being with us all the time, because only the priests knew about God. And it wasn't their brand of God. So they came to Jesus and they tried to stump him up with a question. We're going to talk about that in just 1 minute. But first, I want you to stand one more time. This is